Good afternoon, everyone. Hi. Thank you for coming to Prism Art Fair 2019. This is the beginning of our panels platform. This is December 5th, Thursday, December 5th. And we're kicking it off with a business slash legacy keeping conversation about the arts. And we have three very inspirational women who work in the legal space, in the gallery space, as well as auction and appraising space. And Mavis Gragg, who is an estate planner. Sammetria Goodson is an attorney. She works with artists and collectors who manage or who have collections. And Garbo Hearne is a gallerist that you could actually find here at Prism Art Fair. So they're going to have, I think, a very informed conversation about how to maintain an art collection if you have one. If you're an artist, what tools you can use to manage your practice, and once you do have a collection, how to take care of it. So, ladies.
Hello, there we go. Well, to get started, it actually might make a little bit more sense to hear the perspective of the gallerists and the collectors. So I'm an attorney. Art law is one of my practice areas. If you haven't heard of art law as a practice area, that's because it is a growing area of law. And it's growing because the market is growing, and therefore the risk and the legal issues are increasing as well. So I have prepared today for our discussion actual cases that deal with art collections and some of the major issues that come up. But those cases are only valuable in light of the actual experience of the gallerists and collectors and the trust and estates part. So I'm actually excited to hear from you, Garbo, on just your experience on collecting, and maybe walking the audience through some of the things that they could think about when they're collecting. And then also you, Mavis, in terms of that as well.
Okay, so you want me to get started?
Yes,
okay.
Please do.
Well, I'm Garbo Hearne, and I am the director of Hearne Fine Art. We're based in Little Rock, Arkansas. I opened my gallery space in 1988, so I've got a little more than 30 years of experience. My focus, of course, is African American culture and heritage. I also have a bookstore. But the whole point of collecting is once you make that commitment to collecting art, it's almost, it's very organic in a sense, because the works that you have, you must protect them. You must make sure that they're framed appropriately. You must make sure that anything on paper is conservation framed with the right glass. The backing on it is not torn. You must make sure that you hang it in an appropriate place, not in direct sunlight. And rotating your collection is very important, so that you don't want to keep it in one place too long to get absorbed by any particular sunlight. As a gallerist, I make sure that you have the right documentation. You want to make sure that you get a receipt. You want to make sure that the value of the piece is on your receipt, no matter what adjustment you may have been offered. So that's very important, that information is on your receipt, and you keep these documents in a very safe place. You want to get a bio about the artist. You want to make sure that you know who you're buying from. So a bio about the gallery, that's very important to have all that information in a safe place. Documenting the history of the artist, because once you buy a piece of art from an artist, they become part of your family. So I recommend that you meet the artist, of course, if the artist is alive, of course, and then of course if they have a studio, when you go to that city, that you make sure that you go visit that artist and start that conversation, and you become an ambassador for their work, and hopefully you will continue to collect their work. And so that you're building generational wealth, you're building an artist's career, and you're making sure that your investment is kept in a safe place. It's very also important that as you move forward with your collection, that you have the proper insurance. You know, many of us start collections and we have personal property, and is art part of that? You make sure that when you talk to your insurance person, that they understand that you have a collection, and after you start a certain amount of money, that you may need an additional rider. If you consider your jewelry, you consider the art the same way. So it's important that you keep the proper insurance, and then of course valuation of your artwork, that you want to make sure that you have an appraisal. And generally, when you buy a piece of art, that valuation is pretty much good for 5 years if you keep up with what that artist is doing. And then you want to make sure that you have an insurance appraisal, which will have retail replacement value. And then as you move on, you may, there's state appraisals, there's loss damage appraisals. You may have a piece of art that can have 3 different values depending on the purpose of the appraisal. And you want to make sure that the person that does your appraisal is the appropriate person that is certified to do that appraisal. They should be USPAP certified, they should be a member of one of the associations, and they need to keep up with what's going on in the market. So appraisals are definitely necessary, and it's very important that you, like I said, keep in touch with your artists, keep in touch with your gallerists, and if you move around the country, that you're aware of that.
I would just echo what she said about relationships. So I collect art, and also am an estate planning attorney. And from a collector's perspective, the relationships that you have with the gallerist and with the artist are so important, particularly because as you are growing your collection and you are looking to, have some value, not just the aesthetic value. Right. You want to be able to have access to those folks who, helped you collect the art to begin with. One of the first pieces of art that I purchased was from a gallerist who was at an art fair. They're actually at this art fair, and we've had a relationship for over 6 years, and every so often I reach out to her and say, is there anything I should know about the artist that I've purchased? Is there, and they keep me updated, which is great. But then also I have relationships with the artists, which is, to me, actually pretty cool. And I think that it's helped me evolve from just being a collector to also being what I consider a custodian of the work, of the legacy, and I feel so honored to be able to do that. And so in thinking of myself as a collector and a custodian, I think it behooves you to make sure you protect what you have. And just like Barbara said, you need to have your art insured. And I will tell you from personal experience, most insurance agents don't understand how you value art. They know what's in their policies and procedures, but you really have to escalate the matter to make sure that they're on the same page as you, because if they're not, which I'm sure you're going to tell some horror stories, if something happens to your art, if it's stolen, if it's damaged, it's very possible that you won't get the value that it's worth in your claim. And then from an estate planning perspective, most people don't have estate plans. Most people don't want to think about when they're not here. I think you could consider it more as like a business, a succession planning. And so as custodians, as collectors, and even as artists, you all have a collection of your own work and probably other people's work. It's important to think about what the next generation of custodians is equipped to do based on what you've prepared them for. So having a will, but even considering having a trust. Does everyone know what a trust is? A trust, oh, thanks, that's my sister. A trust is an entity that's created to own something, and the trust has 3 different parties. There's the person who creates the trust, which is the grantor or the settlor. There's the fiduciary, which is known as the trustee, and they're responsible for maintaining the assets of the trust and taking care of them. And then there's the beneficiaries of the trust. So, for example, using my sister as an example, I love her, and maybe I want her to benefit from my art collection, but she's not an expert in art, no shade. She may not know how to, track the value of the art and the provenance of the art. So I can appoint a fiduciary whose role it is to manage it for her benefit, and the art is still getting the care that I would give it if I were in that role. So I think that's really important to think about, especially if the size and the value of your collection expands over time. You want to make sure that you protect that, and you're also doing that for the artist. And you have the ability to decide who gets to benefit from it, how it's used in public spaces. I met a woman recently who collects Black literature, and it's a long, beautiful story, but she has these letters from the 1800s that are describing Frederick Bailey, who we know as Frederick Douglass. So she has these letters that have been in her family for 2 generations. She's been offered $2 million for these letters, and she's poised to make decisions in a way that's informed and secure because of proper planning. I'll let you take the next chapter.
Yeah, that's a great segue and a great story of what can happen when you do have proper planning. So there's some terms that you've heard so far. In terms of the legal framework for collecting, from the perspective of the collectors, from the perspective of gallerists, from the perspective of the artists, there are multiple areas of law that overlay this discussion. Mm-hmm. So you have tax law, you have trust and estates, which we just learned. We just learned the 3 elements of a trust. That's like one of the first semesters of property in law school is to learn that. So you just learned that. There's tax law, there's trust and estates. There's also intellectual property, mostly sitting within the world of copyright, which is very important. You also have issues with just transactional contracts, which is in the civil law aspect of it. Depending on some of the things that can happen amongst families in particular, criminal law might come into play. Family law definitely comes into play. But essentially, you have multiple areas of law that interface with the art world. You also have different sources of law. You may have state law. So trust and estates is usually a function of the law that's written in your particular state. Copyright, on the other hand, is a function of federal law. So there are federal laws that all sort of tie into the Constitution of the United States of America. So those are 2 different sources of law. And then there could even be a situation where you're dealing with the specific laws of your municipality when it comes to storage of works and the control of the movement of works. And then, of course, there's also international treaties. There's international law that also overlays with art collections. So when you're thinking about your collection, you're thinking about stewardship. And really the discussion is about shifting your mindset from just purchasing art to collecting art to then taking it up a step further, and you're now a steward, right? You're a steward of the culture, and the idea is that you want to maintain your collection and these works for posterity. And so with proper planning, with the things that you've heard mentioned, you can position yourself to do that. So when it comes to what you can do as a collector, just at a baseline level, documentation is very important. So it's documentation. Trust and estates is a lot of paperwork, right? A lot of documents. So some of the things you may think about are having a bill of sale when you purchase a work of art. A bill of sale is like a deed. That's different than a certificate of authenticity, which is different than and separate from documents that prove up provenance. Provenance has more to do with the chain of title of a work, and authenticity has to do with making sure that you can prove that the work is what you say that it is. So those are 3 different documents. Often I hear, particularly artists, and sometimes collectors and gallerists themselves conflate the 3, but those are 3 different types of documents. Once you have your collection, you want to work with an art consultant. You want to work with and avail yourself of people who collect, because then they'll tell you about cataloging. Cataloging can be as simple as having an Excel spreadsheet with the name of the artist, the name of the work, the medium, the size, where you purchase the work, the retail price, and which can be distinguished from the price that you've paid. You also want to make sure that you capture the location of the piece. You want to know where the piece is and where you received it from. And then on top of that, you want to also have a file that has all of those documents that I just mentioned. So if you're cataloging your work, you know everything about that piece, you know where it came from, and you also have a folder, probably in the cloud somewhere, with all of the documents that I just mentioned. Also, having a high resolution image of the work is important. That could be important later for cataloging purposes. If someone ever calls you and they want to include your piece in a traveling exhibition, having all these documents at the baseline. So this is sort of like starting out. Having all of these documents and starting your collection with these documents is a way for you to prepare for the future. And then beyond that, you move into preserving the work. That's where insurance comes in, that's where appraisals come in, and you just heard about the different types of appraisals, how often you should get work appraised. You want to be a good steward also in terms of where you put the work in your home. The kitchen might not be a good place.
The bathroom is not a good place for any works on paper. Please don't put it in the bathroom.
Don't put the works on paper in the bathroom. So those are all considerations when you are stewarding your collection. Then when you're moving beyond that, you want to think about your tax documents. You want to think about also your collection, not just as something that you love, and we all collect because we love our works and love what we purchase. But when we're thinking about the future and being able to pass these works on to the next generation, you also want to think about other professionals that you may need to avail yourself of beyond the appraiser and an art consultant. One of those professionals might be an accountant. And if you can find one, you might want to find a tax attorney, whose tax attorneys are usually CPAs that went to law school. So that takes it up another step, because between your tax attorney, your trust and estates attorney, they will be able to help you plan by using wills, by using trust, by using all other different types of mechanisms so that you can get the collection in shape to be able to pass down to the next generation. Yeah.
And then you think about what makes you a collector. If you say you have more than 5 pieces of art, you're a collector, right? Consider that, and you think about, they say if you take good care of your art, it'll take good care of you. When you think about creating generational wealth with your children, you must make sure your children know what you have, or if you don't have children, that your close relatives know, because you don't want your work to end up in a fire sale. So that is why the documentation, and someone knows where it is. If it's in the cloud, if it's on a JPEG, wherever you put it, you need to make sure that someone knows where it is.
So I'm curious, from the two of you, what are some horror stories that you have either dealt with your clients or have heard about that you could share in terms of this issue?
Well, that gives me an opportunity to, I would say, nerd out on some cases that deal with art law and the things that we're talking about today. So I pull some cases. Most of them come from the appellate courts. These aren't cases that have made it up to the U.S. Supreme Court. They usually don't. They usually stop at the appellate level. But essentially, by the time a case gets reported and lawyers look the case up, that means that the issues were not resolved in settlement, and there was a trial, or a judge had to involve him or herself in the discussion, such that there's an actual record of what happened. So these are things that have went completely haywire. That's another way to put that. But in terms of just documentation and the idea that you want to make sure that your family members know your works and what you want to do with them, there was a case called, this one is called Hutchinson versus Spearman. Spearman's a gallery. And essentially there were a set of works that were passed down from the late 19th century. And the artist himself passed away intestate. That means that Artist did not have a will. And the works essentially then passed to a brother. Brother passed away, then the works went to the wife, and then a succession of nieces and nephews. And everything was okay until the final person that had possession of the art collection decided to work with Spannerman to sell the collection. So they put it up for sale, and it sold. And so then there was a family member that came out of nowhere and said, well, wait a minute. I have an ownership interest in this art collection because of the intestacy laws of the state. I should have gotten a percentage of the sale. So again, these works have been passed down from the late 19th century. The lawsuit, this particular lawsuit was filed in 1980. It ended, the court issued their opinion in 1999. So that gives you an idea of the length of time of this collection was passed down, and also the length of the case. So from 1980 to 1999. Essentially, the issue that the court was trying to figure out was whether or not ownership passed through, whether or not the person that sued had an inheritable interest, whether or not there was a trust. I mean, they were really trying to step into the shoes of the artist to figure out what the artist wanted. And essentially the court said and described the art collection as unadministered personality that was distributed without a representative. And the court said, well, we have to look at the behavior of the family and make a logical inference that the works were just supposed to fall in whosever hands they were in, and whoever decided to sell them got the proceeds of that particular sale. So the point there in the cautionary tale is have a will. That's the point of that.
Right.
It's very important. And this was the artist, by the way. This didn't start with a collector. It started with an artist. So this is the artist's collection. The artist's own work was passed down, and it ended up being worth millions of dollars over time. But that's just one case. But it could have been solved by just having a will.
And not just having, I will say from my experience working with people who have children or family members, they feel like you have to give equally. But giving equally doesn't mean that you love them equally. So you can always give differently and it still be as meaningful, and it still show the love that you want to pass on. So, not everyone needs to get your art. Maybe you should set it up so that the executor has the ability to sell your art and then distribute the cash proceeds, or give the art to an institution such as prison. But there's different things that you can do. But your point is that you have to take control and do it while you're alive instead of just leaving the mess for your loved ones. Okay. What about you?
Well, I want to talk about it from a different perspective. So your first piece of art you might have purchased 30 years ago. You may have changed your taste. What do you do with it? Do you take it back to the gallery? Do you expect them to buy it back? Do you take it to an auction house? There's so many ways you can give it away, of course, but think about how that artwork moves on in succession. And you don't have to keep every piece of art you've ever had. You can have a trading party with some of your friends. I mean, there's so many ways in terms of value, because if you think about the first piece of art you ever purchased, as your taste changes, and initially we probably start off buying art for decorative purposes. We're matching our furniture, our curtains, our walls, or whatever. And I don't think that you should buy art for a particular space. You should buy art because you love it, and then you go home and find a place to put it, and then you can move it around in that situation. So there are other ways to move art other than putting it in that place.
So far we've talked about art for posterity, for passing it down, but art's also an investment, right?
Exactly.
So you could put it on secondary market, you can take it to auction, right. And you can also use it as an investment vehicle. So that's something that we often don't talk about, we don't hear a lot about, is the idea that art can be used as collateral for loans. It can be fractionalized. There's so many things that you can do. Art collections in and of themselves, you can think of them as entities, and that entity is something that you can monetize. You can monetize your collection through licensing, you can monetize your collection through publishing, you can have shows that travel, and there are a lot of contracts and a lot of other sort of legal issues that have to be dealt with doing that. But the point is that your art collection is its own entity, right? It has its own personality, is how we would say that in the legal world. So those documents become a lot more important. And then also in terms of investments, again, people use their art collections for investment purposes. So, and if that's something that you're thinking about, or even if you're not thinking about it now, but you want to set yourself up to be able to do that later on, that brings us back to the discussion about documentation. So there's another case that I have. It was actually PNC Bank sued someone. It was an individual that took out a personal loan, and they backed that loan with non-business assets, which included a wine collection, an art collection, and a collection of Ferraris. So things didn't go well, and the individual tried to file for bankruptcy to liquidate those loans. PNC Bank actually sued the debtor and said, wait a minute, under the Internal Revenue Codes as well as the bankruptcy law, you can't discharge this personal loan because you haven't kept good records of the value of the underlying collateral. Court goes through this long process, and there's a lot of pages to this case, but essentially the court walked through and found out that this individual had valued the collection independently, without an appraiser, valued his collection at $100,000 and used that to support the collateral for the loan. Problematic. And come to find out, that person over time sold the pieces of the loan of the art collection, and the art collection actually was only worth about $8,600. So the bank sued the debtor and said, wait a minute, you cannot discharge this loan in a bankruptcy. And the key piece of evidence was that the collector, the debtor, didn't have a single sheet of paper substantiating the sales of the art. Like, could not produce a receipt, let alone the bill of sale, certificate of authenticity, or provenance documents, the three things that I spoke about. He didn't have any of that. He didn't even have a receipt. Could not trace any transactions at all. And so he lost the case and could not discharge that loan, and the bank is the one that sued him. They prevented him from using that as a part of a bankruptcy. That is, I was surprised to see that case. It's rare that a bank will do that, but essentially they were able to do that because this person had zero evidence to support that art collection, the value, provenance, anything. And so essentially their thought was it came out of nowhere and he lied and committed a fraud to get the loan. So that's an extreme case.
Kind of feel like PNC should have taken it because they didn't do their due diligence. Right. But, so are there any artists in the audience? A few artists in the audience? I just want to get a little preachy. So in my experience with working with artists as their estate planning attorney, actually all of them but one have just had a meltdown because it's too hard. One, very difficult to value your work. Like, it's from the artist's perspective, it's very hard for them to value their work. They don't see the value in their work and therefore are very hesitant to put a value on it for the purposes of estate planning. And then also you all create, and so maybe you have amassed a large inventory of work, and it's really important, as my co-panelists have said, to document that work. So you may have thousands of pieces of work, maybe that's a lot, but you may have a lot of work, and then when you're doing this process of planning for valuing it, for planning for what will happen with it after you're gone, it's a huge task. And so if I may just be preachy, I suggest micro movements, and maybe it's not that you're going to go back and inventory all of the work that you've created to date, but you can at least put in that practice now and going forward, and maybe taking small chunks of the work that you've already created to document it. And I think I don't quite understand this from a legal perspective, but you don't have to get copyrights on every single piece. You can do it in series, and that might help with the documentation. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yes. Yes. So if the works are photographs, there are specific processes at the U.S. Copyright Office that will allow you to register those photographs in groups, just completely together, and it's like 1,000 or so images. That doesn't translate necessarily to visual works. You can register a group work, but you must know that when you do that, that if you register 5 works as a group and somebody infringes on one of them, if you go to try to enforce your copyright for infringement purposes, a court might rule that your damages, the amount of money the other person has to pay you, is limited to just that one group versus individually. So if you register the copyright individually, you have, and all of them are infringed upon, you have damages times 5. But if you register them as a group, the court will most likely only give you damages for one. So if you're like a painter or a sculptor, you need to think about that in terms of how you register your works. But you have the copyright from the moment you make something. So that's a common myth. It's like Mythbusters. You do not have to register your copyright to have a copyright. The language that is used in the copyright statute and the way we think about it and talk about it is that the moment in time your work springs to life, there's a copyright. Registering the copyright allows you to avail yourself of federal protection and federal law. This is important because there are statutory damages for copyright infringement. They start at $30,000. And if there is evidence of willful infringement, it goes up to $150,000. So if you don't register your copyrights and someone infringes on them, you are barred from a lot of the remedies that are within the federal statute. So, and that's because copyright's a function of federal law. But if you're an artist and you're trying to make a decision of which works to copyright, ones that, for instance, have been shown in exhibitions, those are ones that you want to register. Works that you have images online, those are ones that you want to register. Works that are already in other people's collections, you want to go ahead and register your copyright. So if those works are out in the wild, they're out in collections, those are the ones you want to focus on. The ones that are in your studio that you haven't maybe sold yet, those may be ones that if you're developing a workflow, like a strategic way to inventory your works, those would be like in group number 2. But the ones that are kind of out in the wild are the ones that you want to focus on in terms of copyright registration.
And as artists, it's very, very important that whatever gallery you work with, that you have a contract. And that contract should have a start date and an end date in terms of how long they're going to keep your inventory, what they will sell your inventory at, and then the other piece is that if there's a discount offered to the client, that you're aware of that and you agree to that. And then if you have a gallery that you've worked with for a period of time, you want to check on your inventory. You want to go in and make sure that they still have it. And you may want to switch inventory out. You don't want to leave a piece of work or works for over 2 to 3 years. That's a long time for a gallery to have your work and have the same pieces. So you want to make sure that they are moving pieces back and forth and you're continuing to update your work, and you want to make sure that if you work with more than one gallery, if you allow them to work amongst themselves, that when one piece of art goes to the next gallery, that you get the paperwork. So keeping that paperwork in one place, and you know where every piece of your work is, because you walk in and you say, wow, I didn't know that piece of artwork sold. You know, that happens, but not in my gallery it doesn't, but it's very important that you keep up with your inventory. And then what happens if someone sells your work and you don't get paid? This is when you call your attorney, correct?
And I'm going to say, what does your contract say?
Yes.
Yes. So contracts are that's a magic word for tonight. It's another magic word, contract, in that essentially what a contract is just a record of your agreement. tells you who's going to do what, when they're going to do it, how they're going to do it, why they're going to do it, and what happens if they don't do it. So most contracts have provisions for breach, which means you account for what happens if someone doesn't uphold their end of the bargain. Now, most art transactions are actually governed by something called the UCC, which is a Uniform Commercial Code. It's rarely yes, it's a monster of a set of codes that many states have. I think pretty much every state has enacted, and it's a uniform set of transactions that govern sales, and so art purchases are a part of that. You often don't see the UCC referenced specifically in contracts, but it's the law that's sort of governing how those transactions happen. Also, depending on your state, you may have consignment laws that are passed at the state level. Texas has one, I'm licensed in Texas and Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania has one, New York has one, California has one. I think Tennessee has one. Georgia does not have one. I don't know about Carolina. Yeah. So some states have consignment laws. You might not see that reference in the document, but kind of operating behind that contract could also be state law. But contracts are important because, again, it's a record of who is supposed to do what and when they're supposed to do it. Now, what I run up against sometimes is I will have an artist who's working with a gallery who says, oh, we just do handshake deals. We don't do contracts. Now, you just heard Ms. Hearne does not run her business that way. No. But there might be something that artists run up against. And so what I've counseled before is that it's one way to look at it from an artist perspective is you want to just think about managing your risk. I mean, if it's a high risk transaction and the person is telling you that they don't use contracts and they just do handshake deals, that might be an opportunity that you can pass up. How do you assess risk? You assess risk on a number of different levels. You know, if it's a gallery that's been in business for a long time and they have a long reputation of not paying artists or doing whatever, that's a high risk transaction. You know already going in that the gallery has a reputation in the community for not being on the up and up. And so then you want to enter into that kind of relationship and not have a contract. So you're just kind of setting yourself up for confusion, which could land you in court, which is what you want to avoid. But contracts are exceptionally important, and one thing that has shifted is that artists have more access to information, they ask a lot more questions, and they are starting to negotiate the terms of the contracts more than they ever have before. From the gallerist perspective, things have also changed for galleries in that they are also looking to decrease the amount of confusion, and so they are wanting contracts that specifically outline the terms, they outline when someone is going to get paid, and then also the marketing efforts of the gallery. The marketing efforts are really important because we're in this world now where you have a lot of artists that can possibly market themselves, right? They're on Instagram, they're very active in social media. And so this conversation about when an artist must pay the gallery for a sale is important. And it's a conversation that you need to have with your gallerist. And it's something that, you know, as artists, you shouldn't be afraid to engage a gallerist with, right? That's the type of conversation that you should be having. But as you were talking, I was thinking about a horror story of a pop-up gallery. This pop-up gallery, yes, you can see where this is going, where there was a handshake deal between friends. I mean, the gallerist and the artist had been friends for like decades. Gallerist decides that they want to have a pop-up space. Artist says, okay. Basically, they plan a retrospective. Communication breaks down. There was a third party in the mix, but that's not relevant for our discussion. But communication completely dissolved between the two parties. This resulted in the gallerist taking all of the artist's work and essentially putting it outside on the curb. And that means it's exposed to elements. Artist comes, cops were called, there's police reports, a bunch of stuff happened. But at the end of the day, my question for the artists was, where is your contract? Where is even an email that describes what is supposed to be happening? And it had to do with the fact that the artists, there was some confusion about how long the work was supposed to be in the pop-up gallery space. And so the gallerist was, their expectation was more so industry standards, but that wasn't communicated. And this is amongst friends, right? Friends, like people, these people were actual friends before this happened. So again, the importance of contracts are not just for business relationships with people that you don't know, but when you're talking about your work, you're talking about these types of transactions, you definitely need something in writing. So there's something to reference in case something goes in the opposite direction.
And you want to make sure that the gallerist has insurance. So it's important that whoever is selling your work has the proper insurance in case there's a flood, and I'm pretty sure the gallerist is not going to put your work outside if they are insuring it. That would be a very, in part of your contract, what happens to my work if someone steals it out of your gallery. So having, the whole contract of the inventory, the insurance, the selling price, everything should be very clear, cut and dried. And it's something that you have a standing contract with the gallery, but every year it's good to go back in and have a conversation, to talk with the gallerist to say, is it time to increase the value of my work? And if so, then is that across the board? So there's great communication that you must have with your gallerist. You have to trust them and make sure that they're doing the things that they're supposed to do to protect you and help your reputation and move your work forward.
I feel like we've given some really hardcore messages today, but I think that the our overarching message is that we should take care of art the way that it takes care of us.
Right.
And it really is, again, from a collector's perspective, being surrounded by art, being able to see the artist's journeys is so much. You can't quantify that. So it's worth it to put in the work to make sure it's insured, to make sure you have an estate plan, to make sure that you have a succession plan. I promise you it's worth it. I'm curious, does anyone in the audience have questions for us? I think he was pointing.
I didn't hear your question, I'm sorry. How do you know the price? Wait a minute, I understand.
How do you start a collection?
How do you start a collection?
Yes.
You start a collection, first of all, you have to love the work. You don't start a collection because you're buying something because the Joneses bought it. You start a collection that reflects you. And once you buy that one piece of art that's an original, let's just say you start with decorative art and then you move into buying an original, and then you move into loving that piece of art, and you move and you meet the artist, you continue to add to your collection, you get different mediums. I mean, it's a process that within your heart, but you must take care of your collection and make sure you have the proper documentation and that type of thing as you go on and on and on, and you continue that.
How do you know it's worth it? How do you know it's worth it?
How do you know it's worth it?
Yeah.
Well, you look into the market of what other galleries are selling the work for. The internet is a good source. I mean, you watch your artists, you keep your artists, what is anybody writing about that artist? I mean, it's pretty clear to figure that piece out.
I do think it's helpful to have an understanding of what your budget is and what your sensitivity is to spending money on art, because I do think the market is it's kind of random in the art world.
Right.
And so I think if you know what you feel comfortable with spending and then center your selection around that, you might feel a little bit more assured that it's worth it.
It's worth it.
I think that I mean, I've bought a piece. I have bought a piece of work that I did not love, but I love it now because it's increased in value like 100%. So,
Okay.
So that was a risk, but it was also very affordable for me at the time.
Right.
So
You should buy the best art that you can afford. You should work with galleries who allow you to buy art on a payment plan.
Payment plans are the
They
best.
are very important.
The
essence of
thank you all for doing that.
yes.
That's helped a lot.
And how do you find the artists?
I think we had one more question over here. Can we give her, yeah.
Okay. The question I have is, what are some of the fees that an artist or a collector is going to incur dealing with a lawyer like yourself to help organize, or other professionals like a CPA or a tax lawyer? What type of fees are you looking at in regard to that? And how do the fees that you pay to organize your collection, does that add anything to the value of the collection itself? Or is it just that it's done? Isn't anything, in other words, does anything come, I don't know how to say this, but like, you're spending thousands of dollars on professionals to position valuable pieces of art. Does that investment go into the art investment, or is there some return on that investment, or how does that work? Because that is definitely an investment on top of an investment.
It is. Even framing is an investment on
Yes,
top
it
of that.
is.
You know, I
So
always
what kind
cringe
of a
when
fee,
I
like
look
if
at
I
how
were
much
to
it
hire
costs.
you, how much would I be paying you over a period of time? Let's say if I had, because actually I have access to, let's say I have access to an artist's entire life work who's popular and who's a successful artist, and I don't have anybody to represent that, and I need to hire somebody. What is the price tag on something like that to get it right?
Well, I'll answer briefly from the perspective of an attorney who has handled estates and what happens on the back end when there's not a plan. I can say at almost every case, well, no, just to illustrate a point, because I do think it's harder to quantify what you're asking. You know, an estate plan on average costs, depending on the person, the complexity of their estate, I would say if you have a pretty straightforward estate, you can get a great estate plan for $1,000, $1,200. On the opposite end, if you don't, or the other end, after you've passed away, if there wasn't an estate plan, your failure to plan could cost your entire estate, which could be worth hundreds of thousands of dollars because it's spent on legal fees. I've seen families, my own family, we probably had $500,000 in wealth in my family between my parents' generation and ours, and at the end we walked away with $30,000 because they failed to plan. So if you want to quantify the investment, I would say that $1,200 investment would have saved $500,000 as opposed to, you know, coming out of pocket on the front end and being stressed about it.
Right. And basically you catalog,
harsh,
you get your work appraised to protect your investment. So it doesn't really add to the value of your collection, but it protects you long term.
Yeah.
And that's a great way to enter the discussion of how much does it cost, because if you try to come on the front end and say, well, what is the sticker price for me today to do the things to protect my collection, you're kind of behind the 8 ball on the mindset. What was just expressed here on the cost of what happens if you don't plan, that's where the real cost comes in, and it's usually your family members or other people that are coming behind you that are paying that cost. But up front, let's say that you have a collection and you don't have an Excel file that has all this information that I discussed, you have to then pay someone, or you then have to take the time to do that. And even if you don't hire, let's say, an MFA intern to do that cataloging for you, you're doing it. So then now you need to ask yourself, what is your hourly rate to go and do something that you could be paying an intern, an MFA to do? So when you're thinking about costs, it's not just what you pay some professional, right? Because I know it seems like, oh, you pay some attorney, you pay some accountant to do something, what do you get for that? The other cost is, what is your cost on your time at your hourly rate to try to figure all of that out when you can be paying professionals to actually do it quicker and more efficiently. But inventory is very important. Before I as an attorney can even assist with a collection, it at minimum I need an Excel file. I need to know what the pieces are, how many there are, where are they, how much they cost. I need to know that information. And an accountant needs to know the same thing. So most of the time, the cost with dealing with particularly accountants and attorneys on the front end is the accountant and the attorney trying to undo things that weren't set up properly. Yeah, so if you get your house kind of in order, that's a way to think about it first. Well, it depends on the condition of your collection. Do you have that information? If you don't, the first place you should start an investment would be to go find an MFA, an intern that can help you catalog that information on the front end, and then engage the services of an accountant or an attorney.
Go ahead. I was just going to say, I'm a big fan of consultation. So it's possible to hire a lawyer or a CPA to do a limited scope consultation to give you an idea of what's needed and what that would cost. And I think it's worth it. It may be that you're paying $150, $250, depends on the professional, but you can say, my goal is XYZ. Can you take a cursory look at this and let me know what's required to achieve that, how much it'll cost, and what the steps will be? And that way you will understand what you're getting yourself into and be able to make an informed decision of whether you want to pursue it. Sorry, I cut you off.
Oh, no problem. But working as an appraiser, the more information you share with me, the easier my job will be, because appraisers work on it's time spent to prepare the report, to do the research. But if you have the proper documentation, you have your receipt, you have information that you gained about the artist, share that with the appraiser. Don't make the appraiser go out and spend all this time and they come back and say, oh, we spent 30 hours and you're trying to go do this guessing game. Did they do due diligence when you had the information all along? So it's very important that you work with your appraiser and share all the information that you have.
I think that's all the time we have, right?
I have a question from an Instagram live viewer.
Hey.
Since I've been videotaping the entire thing on Prism Art Fair's Instagram, I asked them if they had a question. So they have one question. It's from @BFineArtists, and they say, what is their opinion on artists being represented by a vanity gallery versus a consignment gallery? Do they frown on artists who are in vanity galleries?
A vanity gallery, just as a definition, is an artist that represents himself, perhaps in his artist, and then he would take other artists on to represent them. So I wouldn't say that there's a problem as long as everything is clear that he is representing himself and other galleries. So I wouldn't frown upon it necessarily, but it's still necessary to have a contract with that artist that has the vanity gallery. All the rules apply and all that, and you have to make sure that your gallery is paying their sales tax. That's very important, that they are doing good business. So, and that's part of the contract, that they pay the sales tax, not you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for attending. We'll stick around, I guess, in the back if you have questions.
All right, thank you guys.